Did Plato prove that God exists? That is an interesting question. There were a lot of questions that came up before Plato with the pre-Socratics, and they wanted to figure out what was reality like. And there were two in particular that were important, and both had a lot of influence on Plato. One was Heraclitus, who said that everything is in a state of change. You can't step into the same river twice, because once you step in, fresh waters are upon you. Everything's in a state of change, and nothing is permanent. The other one said the exact opposite, and that's Parmenides, who said that nothing changes. Everything is in a state of permanence. Well, interestingly, Plato took both of their thoughts and applied it to his own thinking, and he argued for something that I think is very similar, if you put them all together, to God. So he said that in this world that we live in, everything is in a state of change, that this really isn't the ultimately real world that there is. And you may have heard of his famous allegory of the cave. Probably is one of the most famous allegories ever written. People read it in school all the time. It's in his famous book called The Republic, which is one of the most well-known political philosophies ever written in the history of Western thought. And so Plato said, well, to make sense of this changing world, we need to postulate certain things that make sense of what we experience. So for several reasons, Plato wanted to argue that we have to make sense of, say, the universality and the objectivity of things like justice and morality, because he didn't want to go along with some of the other philosophers of the day who thought that these things are merely subjective, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that justice is somehow not objective and can't be universally known. And he wanted to also answer such problems as the one and the many, which basically says if you've got all the people watching this video, and we say that, we're all humans. Okay, so I'm a human, you're a human. So there's something about us that's singular and unified. That is our human nature, our humanness, he would say. But there's also something different about us. So I am me and you are you. So how is it possible that you and I are different but the same in some way? Where for the Greeks, this was called the problem of the one and the many. And people had various answers for it, and it's still a question that philosophers deal with today. Well, one of the reasons, the way that Plato dealt with this issue is by postulating what he called the forms. Okay, the forms or ideas. Okay, these are the perfect archetypal beings that in some way or another, and by the way, in Platonic thought and scholarship, there's a lot of debate about exactly the role of forms, how they relate to things, and as we're going to see some more later, just a lot of disagreement on Plato. But we can't agree that he held to these forms, and they are somehow the prototypical perfect archetypes of all things that exist, especially of natural things. He had some questioning about mundane things like hair and mud and trash and that kind of stuff. But for example, if I take this remote, and it's white and it's got this shape, right? So if I say, I'm just going to say this is an oval. We take this thing that we're going to just declare to be an oval. Well, what gives it is ovularity a word? Well, it is now. What gives it its ovularity or its oval nature? Well, it would be its relationship to the form of ovularity, or circularity. If it was a circular thing, I could have gotten something easier like this coaster that shows my support for Reasons to Believe, because I have partnered with Reasons to Believe. I actually work with them. I'm a visiting scholar with them, and that's a great organization. And so I have one of these from there and from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Shameless plugs for both great institutions, but this one is circular. My SAS one is squarular, or square, and it has these colors, right? Well, what makes it circular? Well, it's the fact that it has some kind of relationship to the form of circularity. What makes my shirt red where it happens to be red? Because of its relationship to the form of redness. What makes you and me human beings? Our relationship to the form of humanity or humanness. Now, these forms themselves are not physical. In fact, they're immaterial, they're perfect, they're unchanging, they are eternal, they're not temporal, they are simple in the fact that they don't have parts, and they are the true beings. Okay, so for Greek thought here, at least usually, and especially in this Platonic tradition, and really even with Aristotle, something is of a higher order if it's immaterial and unchanging and simple as not having parts and all that. So it's unchanging, eternal, simple, all that. Because those things are not affected or passively changed by something else. So if one thing changes something else, the thing that causes the thing to change is seen to have some kind of power over it. So if I can cause a change, this is kind of a silly example. If I cause this remote to go from here to here, I have some kind of power to affect on the remote to make it move places. Well, if we can affect certain things and cause them to change and be modified in some way, then we have certain kinds of powers over those things. Well, it would seem like, according to Aristotle and Plato, that if things are more perfect, immaterial, changeless, eternal, and they can't be affected by things, then they're more perfect because they're not passively subject to the things that would affect them or cause them to change. So, but listen to the description of these forms again. They're unchanging, they're eternal, simple, not having parts, perfect, immaterial, and ultimately true being, and they have some kind of relationship to all the things that they are patterned after. Now, a lot of dispute about the relationship between the forms and the things that are patterned after the things that are patterned after the form. So, for example, Plato does have a godlike being in his creation mythology that we see, for example, in Timaeus. That godlike being is called the demiurge. There's a lot of debate about the demiurge, about what Plato really holds, because this is a dialogue and it's really more of a mythological story. He doesn't write like Aristotle does in kind of lecture format like I'm talking to you right now. He writes more in stories and dialogue. So it's kind of hard to kind of pin down exactly where Plato stands on some things. So there's a lot of debate about his view of God and the role of God, the role of the forms. Did the God just fashion other things after the forms? Are they copies of the forms? Do they participate somehow in the forms? Lots of debate about this, but we can agree that the forms are unchanging, eternal, simple, perfect, immutable, immaterial, and true being. What does that sound like? That's an awful lot like God, doesn't it? If you're a classical theist especially, and if you study church history, that we describe God as unchanging, eternal, simple, perfect, immaterial, and true being. Now, I'm not saying that Plato held that to theism, because it doesn't seem like he did. And these are different forms. There's not just one form. There are many forms that have these characteristics and somehow or another relate to the things in the world. So I'm not saying that Plato was a theist or was trying to argue for this. But what I find interesting about Plato is he is trying to describe these things as if they have to have some kind of necessary role for the things that we see in our physical experience. Also, it's interesting that we have theologians like Augustine and others who will take these Platonic ideas, or called ideas or forms, and Christianize them, as it were. And so, for example, Augustine will take these forms, or I will refer to them as ideas here, and instead of saying that they're out there in some kind of form land or some kind of ethereal dimension that's hard to explain or really grasp, they exist in some way. This is one of the criticisms that Aristotle had of the forms. That was, we have to, if we postulate these forms, we have to then kind of figure out, well, how do we account for them? Where do they exist? Or is there a where? If they're immaterial, are they located somewhere? What does that really mean? They cause a lot of problems. And Plato recognized a lot of these problems, so did Aristotle. But putting those aside, we have Christians like Augustine who will take these ideas and put them in the mind of God. And so we'll take the Platonic ideas and make them into divine ideas. And so what happens here is you don't have these forms just existing on their own. Because one problem that Christians run into is the problem of what is now called abstract ideas or abstract notions. Because that raises the question, well, if you have these uncreated things, and most philosophers nowadays aren't really full-blown Platonists like this, but there are some in the Platonic tradition, and they do sometimes hold to what are called abstract objects. For example, the number 4, does it exist or not? Well, the number 4 or any number could be seen as an abstract object. What about justice? What about statements like murder is wrong? Well, is the statement murder is wrong always true? This is considered a necessary and eternal truth. And some would say that those kinds of statements are abstract notions that just always exist. And there's different debates in Christianity about how God relates to those kinds of statements and objects. A good book on this topic that kind of explains the different views on this is God Overall by William Lane Craig, who presents the various different views. And while I don't really agree with his view, he does a good job of explaining the different views. There's a 6 views book on God and abstract objects, even though our view isn't really in there as a classical theist. 6 views, and not one of them is Thomistic or Aristotelian in that regard, or anything like that at all, really, that I can remember. But as Augustine takes these forms or ideas and puts them in the mind of God, I think Plato was right about something. You do have to have these unchanging entities, these eternal entities that are simple, that are perfect, that are immaterial to, in one way or another, account for the changing physical, finite things that we experience in our world. Now, whereas Plato doesn't seem to have a doctrine of creation from nothing, creation ex nihilo, we as Christians would believe that all these things, really, the unchanging immaterial being, the eternal immaterial being, the simple being, the perfect being, all this, the true being, and Plato thinks these forms really are the true being. What we're experiencing here in the world, like his allegory of the cave, is just shadows. So the allegory of the cave has people chained, looking at, they've always been in this cave, they're chained looking at a certain wall. They have a fire behind them, and between the fire and them is a row of puppeteers holding up puppets, and which the fire casts shadows of the puppets on the wall, and they see these shadows and they think that the shadows are the real thing. Well, Plato makes the analogy that we actually are these slaves living in the cave, and we think all the things around us are real, but they're not, he says. The real things are the forms. And our education and ultimately death, when someone is taken out of the cave, that represents being educated and ultimately dying, because you are released from your physical prison, as it were, and released into the realm of the forms. But once you go up through education and then ultimately through death, you behold the forms directly. But the forms for Plato are necessary because they have to account for, in some way, the physical aspect of things. So I think he's right here. I don't think he meant to, but I think that this kind of argument does prove that there must be a being that's unchanging, eternal, simple, perfect, immaterial, and which itself is ultimately true and infinite being. He doesn't make the argument for theism, but I think that's what we have here, is that we have a good reasons for saying, yes, what we experience in the contingent world is not ultimate being. It can't account for itself. We cannot go backwards into the causal chain infinitely. There's got to be some terminal cause that ultimately has these characteristics that are unchanging, or in this case, that is unchanging, eternal, simple, perfect, and so forth. And that is going to be, as Aquinas says, what all men refer to as God. So while I don't think Plato was intentionally trying to argue for theism, I think the way in which he argued for the forms can be used as a theistic kind of proof, because we do have to have a being that is unchanging, eternal, and so forth, because you cannot have, contrary to what Plato and Aristotle would say, an eternal regression in time, or as Aquinas would say, in causes, backwards forever. You have to ultimately arrive at true being, which is itself simple, eternal, unchangeable, immutable. And that, as Aquinas says, all men call God. So I do think Plato was right about something, but it's not the forms per se. It's the ideas in God's mind, as Augustine calls these ideas. And ultimately, God fits this description better than the ideas themselves, because God is the only being that is unchanging, eternal, simple, immutable, and perfect. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.